March 20th, 1997. A cold, driving rain washes over Arlington National Cemetery. In a place defined by rigid military protocol, the United States Air Force is conspicuously absent. Only 2 uniformed officers stand in the crowd, and neither had ever actually met the man they were burying. Instead, a senior Marine colonel steps forward. He marches alone to the bronze urn, kneels in the wet grass, and leaves the eagle, globe, and anchor, the highest honor a Marine can bestow. That emblem was laid on the grave of Colonel John Richard Boyd. Over his 24-year career, Boyd contributed more to the theory of air combat and aircraft design than any man in American history. Yet the very branch he served practically erased him from its memory. To understand why a military genius is treated like an enemy by his own people, you have to look at the machine he was fighting against.
Boyd was an uncompromising disruptor, trapped inside an institution built on absolute conformity. In the 1950s, the U.S. Air Force was run by men who had leveled cities in World War II. At the top of the food chain sat General Curtis LeMay, commander of the Strategic Air Command. LeMay forged the Air Force into a sprawling, top-down bureaucracy with one objective. That objective was the doctrine of massive retaliation. The military establishment was convinced that the messy, ground-level skirmishes of the past were over. The next war would be a sterile conflict ending in nuclear fire. To deliver that fire, the Air Force poured billions into fleets of heavy, multi-engine bombers like the B-47 Stratojet. Flying these didn't require rogue warriors. It required compliant technicians. As the pilots joked, they weren't flying a plane, they were driving a bus. In this new atomic era, the traditional fighter pilot was a reckless relic. High-ranking generals argued that jet aircraft were now flying too fast for close-range dogfights. The future belonged to long-range missiles and bomber crews following strict, pre-planned checklists. The Pentagon had engineered a rigid machine that rewarded team players and punished independent thought. It was a system perfectly insulated against outside threats, but vulnerable to a man who operated entirely on his own instincts. Those instincts were forged in Erie, Pennsylvania, during the Great Depression. When John Boyd was just 3 years old, his father died, plunging the family into severe poverty. His mother was left to raise 5 children alone in a hard, blue-collar port town. The pressure reached a breaking point when his younger sister contracted polio. In the 1930s, the disease carried a terrifying social stigma. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid their house. The Boyds were isolated behind large quarantine signs tacked to their front door. To survive the isolation, Boyd's mother installed a rigid psychological code in her son. She taught him that possessing strict principles naturally causes other people to attack you. If you hold on to your integrity, the world will instinctively try to break you for it. Her core rule of engagement was absolute: never complain, never give in, and never compromise your integrity to appease others. To survive, you had to be entirely self-reliant and indifferent to the opinions of the crowd. These early traumas weaponized Boyd's mind. He grew into a man who viewed the world in stark black and white, where a polite consensus felt like a moral failure. When Boyd entered military flight school, that uncompromising psychology immediately clashed with the curriculum. Training in the T-6 Texan, students were taught to memorize the performance manual and stay safely inside the established boundaries. But Boyd refused to respect the manual. While instructors praised a light, finessed touch, Boyd violently manhandled the controls. He aggressively yanked the aircraft past its documented limits, forcing the machine into a physical space where the rulebook no longer applied. In 1953, he carried that exact mindset into the Korean War, strapping into the U.S. Air Force's premier weapon, the F-86 Sabre. It was a swept-wing jet capable of breaking 680 miles per hour, designed to hunt the skies over North Korea. Up in the freezing air of Meg Alley, Boyd realized that real aerial combat possessed no chivalry. It was a primitive, brutal blood sport. You don't salute your opponent. You sneak into their blind spot at the speed of sound and kill them. In an environment where second place means a spectacular crash, Boyd realized that the rigid Air Force training manual was actually a list of fatal limitations. To survive, he had to operate in the chaos the manual tried to ignore. When the Korean War ended, the U.S. Air Force touted a staggering statistic. American F-86 pilots had shot down Soviet-made planes at a ratio of 10 to 1,
It was a total, lopsided domination of the skies. But underneath the celebration, the math didn't add up. Comparing the physical capabilities of the two aircraft, baseline data for the Soviet MiG-15 shows a machine that can pull tight turns, accelerate rapidly, and operate at high altitudes. But when we overlay the American F-86, the problem is clear. The Sabre is mathematically outclassed. The Soviet jet, seen here in flight, could turn harder, climb faster, and hit a higher ceiling. By every metric, the MiG was a superior machine. Faced with this discrepancy, the Air Force establishment adopted a lazy, self-congratulatory piece of conventional wisdom. The planes didn't matter because American pilots simply had better training. Most officers accepted that answer and moved on. But for Boyd, the numbers remained broken. If a smaller, weaker plane was consistently winning, the Air Force was measuring the wrong thing entirely. After the war, the bomber generals effectively exiled the fighter pilots to Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. It was a scorching, barren wasteland, completely detached from the clean, career-climbing bureaucracy of the Pentagon. But to the pilots, Nellis was Valhalla. It was a gladiator school where young men took their jets out over the desert floor and engaged in dangerous, unauthorized dogfights, pushing their engines and their bodies to the absolute brink of failure. Inside this brutal crucible, Boyd launched a years-long crusade. He stopped relying on instinct alone and began tearing apart the mathematical fabric of flight, trying to decode the true, universal laws of aerial combat. The theories Boyd developed in the desert would eventually force the U.S. military to scrap its core tactics for ground and air combat. He was rewriting how the entire U.S. military fights wars. The officers who ignored Boyd's funeral missed the irony of his career. By pushing himself to the edge of the desert and the edge of the regulations, he found the answers the Pentagon hierarchy couldn't even see.